Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you as you file into today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast sponsored by J.J. Keller, letting you know you're in the right place. Just going to give about another minute or so for everyone to get settled. Again, we thank you for joining us. Hello and welcome. Once more, you're in the right place for today's webcast. Just going to allow about another 30 seconds or so as everyone files in today. Thank you. Well, an official hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. General Industries 10 most frequently cited violations. How to avoid being one of those companies, OSHA Cites, sponsored by J.J. Keller. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health Magazine, and will be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. We hope you all are safe and well. In a few minutes, we'll start our presentation, but first, let's review some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and may not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not necessarily mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we'll conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speakers. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey. We'll let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's introduce today's speakers. Today with us are Mark Stromey and Holly Pups. Mark is a senior EHS editor at J.J. Keller, who joined the organization in 1994. He supports a number of topics, including electrical safety, material handling, excavation and trenching, fall protection, and confined space. Holly is an EHS editor at J.J. Keller, who joined the organization in 2021. She's a former OSHA compliance officer with more than a decade of industrial safety experience in areas including warehousing, pharmaceuticals, the public sector, and plastics manufacturing. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation today. Mark, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webcast is presented by the J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite. Finally, a safety solution that works as hard as you do. The Safety Management Suite streamlines compliance at every level of your business, making it easy to develop, implement, and maintain an industry-specific safety program. Because your success is a top priority, today's attendees will be offered complimentary access to our compliance tools and resources in the Safety Management Suite. On behalf of our sponsor, J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite, thank you for joining us. All right, today we're going to talk about the 10 general industry most frequently cited violations. You know, you really don't want to join that crowd, so we're going to give you some advice. Holly was a OSHA compliance officer and has a lot of insights, but it's important for employers to know the hazards people like Holly were looking for during an inspection, and we're going to tell you how to mitigate those. And then at the end, as Kevin said, send in your questions. Don't wait, because we get a chance to look at them while the other person's talking. So let's jump right into this. All right, so you can see the top 10, that is based on data from OSHA, and it started in October 2021 through September 2022. Now, if you've looked at this list before, you can kind of see that these things are always in the top 10, but sometimes they get changed in order. But we're going to cover these. Like I said, this is the most recent data. Okay, so number one, HazCom. That doesn't really surprise me, because Everybody's got hazardous chemicals, or most people do. So this thing really came in hard and fast with over 2,700 violations with over 1,400 inspections. So as we know, if you have one employee and one hazardous chemical, you're covered by this. And because of that, and because this is so applicable to everybody, we're going to spend just a little bit more time on this than some of our other topics, top 10. So let's move on. So Holly mentioned to me as a compliance officer, there were certain red flags that she noticed that made her think there could be an issue with, the employer's HAZCOM program. What were some of those things? Well, she said no written HAZCOM program. So when an inspector arrives on your site, typically they want to look at your 300 log and also all your training programs and written programs. And so it's going to be pretty easy to spot right off the bat. And then we're talking training issues. And one of them was employees don't know how to access safety data sheets. Pretty important right there, right? They got to know how to do that. And the other issue was they didn't know the chemical hazards in their area or how to protect themselves. So pretty serious stuff. You can understand why this was so, this was number one, and I understand that. So taking a look at this, what are the requirements for the written program? Well, the written program, the whole idea of that is to describe how you're going to meet the requirements for things like labels and other forms of warning, your safety data sheets, your employee information and training. That's all in the regulation, and that all has to be in the written program. It also must list the hazardous chemicals that are present in your workplace. So what does it have to cover? Well, it's got to cover the methods the employer is going to use to inform employees of the hazards, including of non-routine tasks. And what would that be? Things that you don't do too often. Let's say you're going to send your employees in and they are going to clean a confined space, a permit required confined space, non-routine. And also things like hazards associated with chemicals contained in unlabeled pipes in their work area. Finally, when there's more than one employer at your site, let's say you have some contractors that are coming in and they're working and they have some employees and they're using chemicals and you're using chemicals, that can get pretty complicated. So you really need to know what the other employers' chemicals are, and they need to know your program, and you have to share things like safety data sheets. You need to talk about any precautionary measures. And importantly, you need to have a discussion on your on-site labeling system, because maybe their employees aren't familiar with it. So these are all things you're going to do in advance. So, all right. Now, I mentioned 2 training issues on a couple slides before this. Let's start with the one where the employees don't know how to access SDSs. So the regulation requires that all employers train workers who have potential exposure to hazardous chemicals before they're assigned to those jobs. That makes a lot of sense. But then it goes even further, saying, hey, you need to provide additional training whenever a new physical or health hazard is introduced. And what would an example of that be? So let's say that you're using a new solvent. Okay, so you get the solvent in, it comes with the safety data sheet. So what you want to do is look at that SDS, figure out what the hazards are, so you can determine that what needs to be done to protect your employees. Do we have to resort to PPE, or can we do something else? And also, do not forget that this includes any temp or contract employees you have working at your facility. Taking a look at that other training issue that I mentioned, which was employees don't know the chemical hazards in their area, or they don't know how to protect themselves. Well, OSHA requires that part of the training must include providing information on the hazards your employees could be exposed to. So how would we go about that? Well, one way is you can train workers using the chemical SDS. That's a really good way for them to get familiar with the layout of the safety data sheet and where it talks about the hazards in the PPE. And then you have to maintain an SDS for each hazardous chemical in your workplace. That way, if the employee wants to see what that SDS says about, for example, the types of PPE they need, they can look that up themselves. So very important that they have access to that. Now, on the slide, you can see these typical hazards. You got to train your employees on the measures they take to protect themselves, right? And this could include things like, oh, maybe we're going to talk about appropriate work practices. We're going to talk about emergency procedures. We're going to cover the PPE that they need to use. OSHA requirements. Specifically, I want to talk about this because we get a lot of questions, Holly and I, about SDSs. So what makes them so important? Well, again, they list all the hazards. There's a whole bunch of different information on it, but you need to have those readily accessible to your workers during every shift and when they're in their work area. So they need to know where those are located, and there must be no barrier to access. So you can't have the employee, hey, Mrs. Supervisor, I need a SDS. Or you keep them in a locked cabinet because they can't access them. And if there's an emergency, they're going to need that ASAP. Okay. Another thing OSHA says, you can have those in a hard copy or an electronic format. We'll talk a little bit about that, but you can't have them have to do an internet search for the safety data sheet. Can you imagine how long that would take? But you can, and a lot of people do, you can maintain them on a company website, or you use, let's say, an offsite web-based SDS service provider. But there's a caveat. You have to make sure there's a backup procedure and system in place in case they can't access that primary system. Maybe it's down, okay? You got to have a backup procedure. And you also have to train your workers on how to access the SDSs, both on the computer and then the backup system. Maybe your backup system is a hard copy. Remember, again, in the event of an emergency, these hard copy SDSs must be immediately available to medical personnel. So that's why a lot of companies do have both. It's difficult. It is kind of a pain, but that way you definitely can provide that in a case of an emergency. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Holly.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. And just one little tidbit I'd like to throw in there about your safety data sheets and making sure that your employees are actually trained on how to access them, like Mark just talked about, is when you are doing your inspections, your walkthroughs, ask an employee to show you, hey, if this chemical spilled, what should I do? Where would you go to get the information? Because as a compliance officer, that's often what we did, is we would find a chemical and pick a random employee and have them walk us through their process and figuring it out, making sure that they understand where to get the SDSs and what hazards are associated with the chemicals in their work area. And with that, I think we will move on to respiratory protection, which is number 2. If you could switch to that slide, please. So OSHA's respiratory protection standard applies to employers who have employees who are exposed to hazards in which the respiratory protection standard says it's required, or if they are choosing to voluntarily wear respiratory protection in certain situations. OSHA keeps an eye out for violations on this standard, as the consequences for not complying can absolutely be deadly or impact folks for the rest of their lives. In the last year of data, OSHA found 2,044 violations over about 1,000 inspections, with a total penalty of about $5.6 million, which is $1 million more than the top cited one of hazard communication. So in my time as a compliance officer, the things that I looked for or that stood out to me regarding respiratory protection were like, the employees can't tell me what chemicals they're working around, going back to the HAZCOM, but also they can't tell me which ones require them to wear respiratory protection. Another easy low-hanging fruit would be employees wearing respirators with only one strap on, or they're not sealed, they're fogging up. There's other things that stand out that tell me that that respirator has not been properly fitted. Another good one is the condition of respirators. So during walk-around inspections, you would see folks hanging them on their lockers or hanging them in the work area, and they would have dust and debris and just generally look in bad shape. And that tells me that there's a problem in the training as well as the practice or implementation. And then the last thing here is when employers state confidently that they are only using the Appendix D for respirators for voluntary use. That does apply in a lot of circumstances, but based on the safety data sheets, based on their industrial hygiene data, respirators might actually be required. And so Appendix D does not apply if the employees are actually exposed to these hazards. So some of the requirements, obviously, we can just touch on a couple of the big pieces here, is you are required to identify and evaluate the respiratory hazards in the workplace. So making sure that you have the appropriate respirators that are right for oxygen rich or oxygen deficient environments. If you've got harmful dust, fogs, mist, gases, vapor sprays, you've got to do your hazard assessments to make sure that you've got the right respirators for the task at hand, so it is providing adequate protection. You are also required to have and implement a written respiratory protection program that includes the worksite specific procedures and elements that is required for your respirator use. The program is broken down into 11 parts. And then the last part of this is making sure that you have a program administrator, somebody that the company has designated to be in charge of this respiratory protection program, and that they are updating it to reflect the changing workplace conditions that might affect respirator use. Excuse me. So when you're doing your workplace evaluations, again, you want to make sure what's written on your program matches what's actually being done in the workplace. So again, you have your respiratory protection program that's evaluated by a program administrator. They're doing spot checks in the environment to make sure that people are doing what it actually says. And then you have someone talking with employees to determine how effective is this program. Are they actually following it? Are they seeing problems? Are they doing workarounds because what's written in the program doesn't make sense? There's a lot of pieces there. And we mentioned making sure that you have the right respirator for the hazard at hand. So respirators protect respirators protect employees in two basic ways. The first is the removal of contaminants from the air. Respirators of this type are called particulate respirators, which filter out particles. And then you have air purifying respirators with cartridges or canisters that actually filter out the chemicals and the gases. There are other respirators that supply clean breathing air or from another source. Those fall into the ones that fall into that are like your airline respirators and your self-contained breathing apparatuses, which is SCBA. The next piece here is you've also got to train employees and make sure that they are able to demonstrate the knowledge that they've gained from this training. So they need to be able to answer questions like, why is the respirator necessary? What can the respirator protect them against? What can't they? What does it not protect them against? If you have to use them in emergency situations, suddenly there's a big problem and they've got to throw a respirator on, do they know the actual steps to go through that process? They also need to know how to inspect the respirator for damage, wear, and tear, put it on, remove it safely so that they're not exposing themselves to additional contaminants. where that respirator is supposed to live when it's not in use, making sure that it's properly maintained and staying out of areas that would continue to damage it. And then lastly, do your employees know how to recognize when there's a problem with the respirator, when they've been exposed, maybe there's a leak? What are the medical signs and symptoms that there is a problem? And then you also, as if you require respirator use, you have to have a medical evaluation to determine an employee's ability to safely use a respirator, including N95s, if they are required to be used. And so that's a lot of information. And so now we're going to hop on to number 3 of the top violations, which is lockout tagout. The requirement for lockout tagout applies to employers who perform maintenance on equipment where there is the potential for an uncontrolled release of hazardous energy. That's a complicated way of saying if employees are going to be exposed to a sudden startup or sudden movement of the equipment that they may be performing maintenance on, then lockout tagout is required. So OSHA found 2,100 violations over about 1,100 inspections. But compared to the top 2, the the penalty amount is significantly higher at over $16 million in that 1 year, which is, as we said, the highest of all the general industry violated standards. So, looking at lockout tagout, a lot of red flags that stood out to me when I was doing my walkthrough inspections would be if when there's an issue with the lockout tagout program, you would see I would ask an employee to walk me through a lockout tagout procedure. What are the energy sources? What magnitude of energy are you exposed to at this location? And how do you shut it down and get it back up again? Another piece to your required program is making sure that your energy control procedures are inspected. So if the employer didn't have an inspection sheet that showed me what they went through, that was definitely a big red flag. And this is a common thread through this presentation, but when you ask employees about, hey, what training have you received around lockout tagout? I got a lot of bewildered looks going, what do you mean training? We just do it. So to avoid joining the crowd of many people and with high violation penalty amounts, follow the standard's most critical requirements. So the first thing is you've got to have an energy control program, a hazardous energy control program that is developed, implemented, and actually enforced. You don't want it just sitting on the shelf with dust on it and no one knows that it even exists. You also want to have lockout devices for all of your equipment that can be locked out. Tagout devices are allowed when there are no lockout options for that equipment, but that is very rare and few and far between. You've got to have your energy control procedures that actually represent the equipment and the steps that employees have to take to lock that equipment out. You should only use your lockout tagout devices that are authorized for that equipment and machinery, because if you use something too small, someone might be able to get around it, might be able to bypass it. It needs to be fitted and specific for your equipment when required. And then you've got to establish a policy that only permits employees who applied that lock and tag to be the one that removes it. If you do have to have, and there's an emergency and somebody else, there should be a very detailed and step-by-step program on how the company would go about contacting that person and making sure that they can remove a lock safely without putting others in danger. And your last 2 big pieces, again, for lockout tagout are going to be inspecting your energy control procedures at least annually. If you get new equipment, get new power sources, you should update these things as they come up and not wait for that annual review. But your annual review is where you catch the pieces that have fallen through the crack, and you want to make sure that things are being done the way that the policy and the procedures intend. And then lastly, you've got to have effective training for all of your covered employees. And with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Stromey.
Thank you, Holly. And again, please keep the questions coming in. We want to answer those. We have quite a bit of time at the end that we're setting aside for questions. So moving on to number 4 here, powered industrial trucks. Like HAZCOM, this applies to a lot of companies because we have forklifts. What are we talking about? This is equipment that's powered for horizontal movement. Things like your sit-down forklift, your order picker, powered pallet jacks, stand-up forklift like the one we got there, and narrow aisle forklift trucks. Now, you may have multiples of these on your site. You may only have 1 or 2, but since companies have more than one, it's not surprising because, you have to train. There's specific training requirements. And I'm going to talk about that. So I'm not surprised it made this number 4. 2,000 violations, 1,400 inspections, $7 million. That is something substantial, right? 7 million. All right. OSHA is going to be looking for things that indicate issues with the PIT program. What would some of these be? How about unsafe behavior? How about we have somebody speeding? They're not wearing their seatbelt. They're carrying the loads too high. Forklift condition opens up questions about inspections. So you're running a forklift and it's got huge gouges. The OSHA person says, hey, don't you inspect this? How come you missed that? Maybe you have broken tines, backup lights aren't working, and then a lack of proof of inspection. Now, OSHA actually doesn't require it to be documented in writing, but really that's the way you should do it because then it's being done and you have proof of this inspection in case an inspector comes in. They're going to ask, hey, where are your inspection sheets, or do you do it on a computer? Let me see it. Oh, we don't do it. We don't document. Okay, that's kind of a, it's a red flag. All right. And when you think about these forklifts, they're pretty heavy and some of them can be pretty big, and that creates hazards to people working around the equipment and also to the operator. And that's where this unsafe behavior comes in, because it can be problems resulting in load shifting. Maybe it's falling off the forks. The load just literally falls off the forks because of improper load handling, which could be a training issue. The operator's careless when placing loads on a rack, damage the rack and even the forklift. I've seen that happen. And then how about the operator speeding and doesn't have time to react when there's a pedestrian and heaven forbid they make contact? So not good. And inadequate maintenance, well, what can happen there? Accidents, near misses due to failure of components, critical components like brakes, steering, maybe the lights are broke, the horns broke, so when they try to use it, there's no sound. And this is where that daily inspection comes into play. You inspect to identify potential problems areas, but before they can cause, breakdowns or injuries to people working around or even the operator. OSHA's requirements, if anybody's really looked close at 1910.178, it's a very extensive regulation. I personally feel it's probably the best written regulation. It is a little complicated, but if you look at it, and that's why we get so many questions on it. But the regulation requires employers to observe capacity ratings, right? You're going to look at the capacity or the data plate because that talks about essential information on this, all sorts of things. It talks about attachments. It talks about everything, stability triangle. So you need to look at that. Train operators, document the training and evaluation. And we all know that operators have to be reevaluated at least once every 3 years. So we'll talk about that in a bit. And then provide refresher training. If they're operating unsafely, let's say a load falls off the forks, yes, you would do refresher training, but you'd only have to do it on load handling. You don't have to talk about other things not related to that. And then, of course, allow only qualified persons to train operators, and ensuring equipment is inspected at least daily. And just a bit about the training part, because sometimes it's not really clear to them. So what OSHA says is all operator training and evaluation must be conducted by persons who have the knowledge, training, and experience to train operators and evaluate their competence. That's it. It's up to the employer to make sure that the trainers meet these general requirements. There is no OSHA requirement for your trainer to go out and take a certain class or have any sort of certifications or be recertified as trainers at specified intervals. They do need to be reevaluated every 3 years, just like anybody else that runs a forklift. And there has to be a combination of training. This is laid out specifically in the regulation. You need formal training. So you're going to have them in a classroom setting. You're going to talk about your forklifts. You're going to maybe show some videos, maybe have written documents handed out. Then they have to receive practical training. What does that mean? Well, your instructor is going to demonstrate functions of the forklift, and the practical exercises are going to be performed by the trainees. So the trainer is going to show them how to maneuver the forklift, and then the trainee is going to do that, and you're going to build up from there to carrying loads and stuff. Finally, the trainer must evaluate the operator and certify it in writing. And that is a very important part, and Holly can attest that sometimes we're a little lax with that. So complying with these requirements is essential if OSHA knocks on your door, especially showcasing your training program. It can be time-consuming creating and customizing your safety training program, policies, and procedures. And since J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite is sponsoring today's event, we'd like to offer our attendees access to customizable training resources and templates that will easily help you produce the materials you need. So you see that poll there. We're going to leave that up for a bit, but go ahead and use that. And we're going to send you our white paper, OSHA's Top 10 Violations, which the title describes exactly what it is. So moving on, we're going to talk about machine guarding, number 5. So when we think about machines, they have the potential to cause all sorts of severe workplace injuries. We're talking about crushed fingers, hands, amputations, blindness from parts flying off. So you have to safeguard your machines because you're protecting these workers from these preventable injuries. Any machine part, function, or process that may cause injury, you have to safeguard it. When the operation of a machine or accidental contact would possibly injure the operator or others in the vicinity, you have to eliminate or control those hazards. And machine guarding is one way to do it, 1910.212. Now, when we think about this, 1,400 violations, almost 15 during 1,300 inspections. And as Holly can attest to, you might be cited for multiple of violations. So you could have a HAZCOM and a machine guarding, heaven forbid. Now, the total penalty here, which I was shocked, is over $12 million. That's the second highest of all of GI violated standards. And I think the reason for this is, the injuries they're reportable, they're severe. So OSHA is going to come out and do an inspection and talk to your employees. So I guess now I'm really not that shocked because of what potential injuries and worse to your employees can result if you drop the ball on this. Okay, what's OSHA going to look for here? How about things like the workers can actually touch unguarded moving parts? That's pretty obvious. If the guard is off and something is spinning, or the guard's missing. And also the last one up here is important too, not understanding how the minor servicing exception works, because that is only used in very special circumstances. OSHA is going to look for things like, what type of machinery do you have? Have you determined the types of machinery? 1910.213 through 0.219, those are machine specific standards. So you need to determine, number one, do I have machinery that fits into those categories, those standards there? Or is the equipment covered under the catch-all guarding requirements? And that was 1910.212. So that's the first thing you got to do there. Then we're going to look at, you have to provide one or more methods of machine guarding to protect the operator and other folks in the area from hazards created by things like, how about a point of operation? Ingoing nip points, rotating parts, flying chips, and sparks. So, things can fly off the machine if you're doing different types of machining. Chips can be generated. And some of the machine specific standards that I mentioned have very narrow guidelines for safeguarding. So look at that. Point of operation of the machine has to be guarded. All guards that are required must be on the machine and securely affixed. They can't just be propped up there. And then the last one before I turn it over to Holly, machines that are designed for a fixed location, they have to be anchored, literally anchored to the floor, or they're going to be moving around. I was in a facility where I saw a bench grinder doing that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Holly.
Thank you so much, Mark. So number 6 is your electrical violations under 1910-303. So this is the general types. We have a lot of violations and not very many inspections. So 1,000 violations and about 800 inspections with a fairly high penalty of over 5 million. And much like Mark was just saying, is the chance of a severe injury is much higher here than with some of our other violations. So what I looked for when I was a compliance officer, and again, these are the easy things you can walk out on the floor and look for yourself, is something like blocked electrical panels or having stuff stored on top of panels. A lot of times people would put drums and boxes and other things on carts that they say they can move out of the way, but they're still blocking the panel, and in an emergency, they're difficult to get to. Another easy thing to spot was the lack of markings on the panels that told you what it was fed from, what it feeds, and what the magnitude of the energy inside is, what's the voltage and amperage inside. And then, of course, talking to employees about the personal protective equipment that they are required to use when they're working on these types of things. If we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, thank you. In general, the standard requires employers to use equipment that's free of recognized hazards and that it is actually intended for the location it's installed. They need to be listed and labeled, for example, with Underwriter Laboratories or the UL marking. You also have to install and use these electrical pieces of equipment according to the manufacturer's instructions. A lot of times employers will bring in pieces of electrical equipment and kind of rework it so it meets their needs, but it violates the manufacturer's intentions. And then you can only use electrical equipment with the following durable markings: manufacturer's name or trademark, the voltage, the current, the wattage, and any other necessary information. As I mentioned, blocked electrical panels are a big thing, and so it's important as the employer that you're providing and maintaining sufficient access to these panels, and that when people are working in them, that they are not being cluttered in by other things. So you have to keep a nice, clear area in front of your electrical equipment. And then again, you have to provide the appropriate personal protective equipment for each of your employees. So number 7 is piggybacking off of number 6 is your wiring methods, components, and equipment for general use. There are a few less violations here with a total penalty of about $2 million. But these are items that are also just easy to spot. If you go to the next slide, please. So when you're walking around your facility or OSHA's walking around, you see plugs with burn marks coming out of the top or damaged plugs that have been replaced, extension cords, tools. Your electrical cords need to be in good condition. And so as a compliance officer, I'd pick up tools and check the entire plug and see if it's been repaired, if it has exposed wires, if the ground pin has been popped off. And then your tools also need to be rated for the electrical work. So if you do have employees that are qualified to be doing some of this electrical maintenance and things, you need to make sure that their tools are rated for electrical work. And as all things, my favorite topic is training. Is have you trained your employees to make sure that they are fully qualified to be doing the work that they're doing? Or are they just competent? Or as what I ran into as a compliance officer is, yeah, so-and-so has been doing it for a long time. I think he knows what he's doing. Most of the time they did not. So in general, the standard requires that employers and employees understand temporary electrical power and lighting installations, that these can only be used for a limited number of activities and for a limited amount of time. You also have to know that flexible cords and cables can only be used in limited circumstances, and they need to be rated, just like your electrical panels, for the application in which they're being used in. And then also you've got to know what the requirements are for grounding so that employees are protected from your electrical hazards. And with that, we'll hand it back to Mark.
Very good information. Keep the questions coming in, please. We're getting some good ones. All right, moving on to number 8, PPE, and that's found at 1910.132. Another one of my most favorite standards. I like the way that's laid out. It's very short. 730 violations only, though, during 616 inspections. But look at that, 2,500,000. Again, severe injuries can result from you not doing the hazard assessment and providing the proper PPE, which could result in a recordable reporting to OSHA, which means they'll come and pay you a visit. So OSHA is going to be looking for what? What would they come in and see that would indicate a red flag? How about things like PPE in poor condition? You know, Holly talked about respirators and stuff earlier. You know, that's a major piece of PPE, very important. And if that's not in a good condition, that's a dead giveaway. Other things like, you know, gloves that are torn, you know, safety glasses that are so scratched up that you can't possibly see through them, which indicates the employee might not be wearing them other than the fact that there is an inspection going on. So you do need to replace PPE that's typically, especially things like safety glasses that get scratched up, or you know what, another dead giveaway, they're using the wrong PPE. That's often the case. It could be with respirators, but again, it could be they need cut resistant gloves. They have gloves on, but they're not the appropriate gloves. And what do we need to know about this? OSHA has a specific requirement at 1910.132D. I recommend you take a look at that. You have to assess the workplace to determine what hazards are present that require PPE. Not only that, you have to document and certify that you did that. You sign off. You're putting your name on a line on a form that OSHA is going to look at when they come and visit. Appropriate PP must be provided based on those hazards. In most cases, you're going to provide it at no cost. There are very few limitations, so I would recommend not even worrying about that. Instruction. Yes, you do. You can't just hand them, a hard hat and just say, okay, here, put it on. You can't give them anything that needs fitting and not help them understand how to use it. And not only that, just because you give them the safety glasses or the gloves or whatever, the electrical PPE, you have a responsibility that they wear it. So you need to enforce that in however way you decide, but you need to make them wear it, because if they don't, it's still going to come back to haunt you and it's going to haunt them. Establish inspection and maintenance procedures so that you're not just handing something out to an employee and never taking a look at it again. Maybe once a month you could have a toolbox talk where you inspect everybody's PPE, and that way they can say, hey, yeah, my safety glasses are really scratched up. Can I get a new pair or whatever? So very important. General duty clause. This is really interesting. I'm going to turn it over to Holly for 10, but 674 violations, 643 inspections, and $5 million, over almost $6 million in fines. It's amazing. So what would OSHA be looking for? Holly said that things that could generate a general duty clause violation would be ergonomic issues. There was an OSHA rule years ago, and they pulled it out at the last minute, like right before it was supposed to go into effect. So those are going to be on the OSHA 300. That's a dead giveaway. Heat-related illnesses, another area that OSHA is looking for. And they also have used the general duty clause to cite for workplace violence. How about poor air quality? Conveyor belts, they use it for that. And they also use it for storage racks, because there is, in the material handling, there is no regulation for storage racks other than just general information. But if your storage racks aren't labeled with capacity or they're damaged, that's what they're going to do. They're going to cite you under that. Okay, let's see. So in general, the standard is kind of vague, but it requires covered employees to, make really good faith efforts to correct existing workplace hazards, identify and address new hazards as they come up. They want you to regularly review your accident and injury records. Why? Why would you want to do that? Well, you're going to identify injury patterns and other areas of concern. Accident investigation. Every one of those should be done. Accident or injury that you have, to determine the specific causes and try to figure out whether there's anything you can do to prevent that from happening again. And yeah, you don't want OSHA coming back for the same type of accident after you reported a hospitalization. They will, as Holly can attest, really put a fine on you. Conduct JSAs, job hazard analysis, or job safety analysis on a regular basis, because you want to identify hazards associated with every single job. Okay, now that sounds like a daunting task, but you do want to identify any new hazards that have popped up. Things change, Document your training efforts, conduct periodic retraining as necessary, and consider establishing an employee safety committee in the workplace. I'm familiar with the Canada OSHA regs, and most of them, or if not all, require you to have a safety committee, which I think is really a great thing. And then when you met the letter of the law, step back, critically assess whether this process still might be unsafe, and then take further action. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Holly.
Thanks again, Mark. So at the bottom of our top 10 comes the record-keeping violations. So there were 632 violations and about 600 inspections, so about one each time, with a penalty of over $2 million. So when I looked at record keeping for an employee's workplace safety program, I would be looking for things like, what are their OSHA logs saying? Do they have OSHA logs? Are they fully filled out? If there are no accident investigation records, all of your recordable injuries do require that you fill out your OSHA 301 or equivalent. And then that there's no follow through on your accidents, meaning you had a horrible thing happen, somebody got hurt, and there's nothing to show for it. There's no investigation, no improvement, etc. So, to combat this so that you're not added to this top 10 list next year, you want to make sure you are keeping accurate injury and illness records. You have to certify, assuming you are required to keep your 300 or 301. You have to certify and post your annual summaries of these injuries and illnesses from February through April each year, and they need to be put in a prominent location that employees would often see. You want to keep all of your medical and exposure records for at least 30 years. Employers often get rid of them when employees leave, but they are required to keep them, so that's a common citation. And then the thing that most employers get caught up on is when to report to OSHA. So all employers, even those who are exempt from other record keeping requirements, must promptly report to OSHA all of your work related fatalities, inpatient hospitalizations, amputations, and a loss of an eye. And an important note there is if you have any fatality on your site, whether it is due to a personal medical condition like a cardiac event or heart attack, that you still have to report that to OSHA. It doesn't mean you're going to get an inspection, but you want to report with all the information that you have within 8 hours, or you could be facing a violation. And with that, we covered quite a bit of information today. And we hope that you get the white paper that summarizes all of this. And we hope that you enjoyed your time with Mark, myself today. And so we are going to hop to your questions. So please send them in if you haven't already. And while you're sending in those, I'd like to thank our event sponsor, J.J. Keller Safety Management Suite. Again, with your complimentary access, you'll gain access to all of our most popular safety management tools, including access to our expert help with folks like Mark and myself, written safety plan templates, customizable training programs, audit and inspection lists, and word-for-word regulations, some state regulatory comparisons, and so much more. Let's see. So if you missed the opportunity earlier for complimentary access and you aren't ready, please let us know in your interest and how we can help you with the poll on your screen. Along with your access, we'll email you a copy of the top 10 violations white paper. And with that, we will hop over to questions. We've got quite a few good ones waiting for us.
Kevin, are you going to help us out with those?
Yes, absolutely. We will get to those here shortly, but again, before we start the Q&A, just want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey that we are asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after the webinar, and we appreciate your input as it always helps us improve our future webcasts. As Mark and Holly indicated, a lot of great information covered today and a lot of great questions, so we'll get going with those. First one to Mark, just wants to clarify, are these numbers national?
Yes, these are federal OSHA numbers, and the new batch should be coming out because September is coming to a close. So that closes that out. So they will start to compile the new top 10 and all the other statistics that OSHA puts together. And so we will have a new top 10. It takes a while, but they will, and again, remember, these things generally stay in the top 10. Maybe one will fall off, but they're typically the same ones, but the order may be different.
All right, thank you. Next question goes to Holly, and it asks, regarding HazCom SDS, are we required to keep a separate SDS sheet for each individual brand of unleaded gasoline we have in each department, and what particular gas station they use each time may vary, the questioner says.
So the requirement is that you keep safety data sheets for each individual chemical that you have on your site. To my knowledge, there's no requirement stating which gas station it came from. But you would have to look up the safety data sheet from whichever company you are regularly purchasing your gas from and get that and keep them on hand. And so with that, I would recommend having like a set couple of locations that employees would go to so you can help keep track of that.
All righty, thank you. Next question for Mark. Was there a release or change on the requirement of PPE regarding the fitment for all employees? For instance, just the idea that women are usually smaller and the vests may be too large.
Yes, there's a proposed rule. Okay, so it's not final, but it's proposed. So, and it's very minor change. It changes like one sentence saying essentially what it says is the PPE should fit the user. And it's just going to put more emphasis, since it's actually, if it does become a final rule, it will actually have that verbiage in there and require, employers to follow that. And if not, they can be cited.
All righty, thank you. Next question for Holly. What are some common violations with gantry cranes?
So gantry cranes, what OSHA compliance officer is really going to look for is the general condition of that crane and how it's being used at the time. So the easiest thing to spot is if they're lifting loads over people and not clearing the area. And if they do see the use of the crane or they suspect some maintenance issues, they will likely ask to see your inspection records. And they might ask you to pull down the cable a little bit and inspect and look for things like bird caging or damaged hooks or making sure that your rigging is up to par. But that is a less common violation, but it does happen from time to time.
All righty, next question, Holly, also is for you, and it asks, what if an employee lies during an inspection to OSHA or simply does not remember the training?
So there's two parts to this. If an employee lies during an inspection with their interview with a compliance officer, typically that is a one-off. And so you're not going to get cited because one employee says, "Oh, I don't remember." If there is a situation of somebody saying that they didn't get trained or they don't remember their training, what OSHA is going to do is going to talk to a couple of employees and they're going to compare notes from employee to employee and see if there's a systematic problem. If it is a one off, hopefully you have a nice compliance officer that will be like, hey, we've got one employee who doesn't remember. It might be time to refresh. Um, but they're going to compare the training records to what multiple employees say. And so one disgruntled employee is not going to ruin the bunch.
Next question, looking for a clarification, and it says, with the reporting of fatalities, though they're not work-related, they only apply to those occurring while on the clock, correct?
You report any fatality that happens on your site with your employees, period. So the one exception to that would be if somebody wandered onto the property and passed away. But if it is your employees and they are on site, you are still going to report it to OSHA no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question asks, it's for Mark, and it asks, how does OSHA inspect chain falls?
Okay, good question, because they are not covered. So we're talking about like a hoist. They are not covered under the gantry crane, overhead crane thing. There's a lot of interpretation, but what I would do, obviously you're looking for the same types of thing that you would with an overhead crane. And what you want to do here, anytime you have equipment, you want to look at the manual that comes with it, because most times it will talk about maintenance and inspection, and do you have to lubricate it? How bad does the chain have to be before you replace it? So again, this is kind of a one-off thing, but they're everywhere. I've seen them in multiple locations because they're very simple to use. They're typically stationary and they're used all the time, shift after shift. So certainly there can be things that need to be inspected, repaired, or replaced.
Well, thank you. I know we're winding down on time, but any closing thoughts from either of you, Mark or Holly?
I would say thank you for coming and listening to Holly and I. And if you have any questions, you would reach out to Holly and I, and we would like to help you out. And again, Holly, anything from you?
No, I think you covered it. We appreciate everyone coming and asking questions and taking part. So we hope we can help you in the future.
Okay, well, again, no, thank you. And unfortunately, we have run out of time today. Sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but all of today's unanswered questions will be forwarded along to Mark and Holly. Once again, hope you take the time and fill out that forthcoming evaluation survey and give us your feedback. With that, we end today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. We'd like to thank Mark Stromey, Holly Pups, everyone at JJ Keller, and all of you who listened in. Thanks and have a great day.